Welcome back to another episode of The Joy of Sewing. I'm fashion sewer Joi Mahon. Now we're going to talk about the sewing machine needle, and that's an integral part of your sewing project. We've learned about in a previous episode things to look for when purchasing a sewing machine, but there is one little tool that you do need to purchase separately from your machine, and that is the sewing machine needle. Now, your machine may have come with a package of needles. It might look something like this, and they could all be the same. They might be a little bit different, but I want to talk about what the heck is a sewing machine needle, and why are there so many numbers and sizes and names of them? To kind of debunk this, let's look at the makeup of the needle. Now we have this giant Schmetz needle right here, and it's kind of basically a really large version of the smaller needle that's going to fit in your machine. And most of our needles are about an inch long. So this is going to look really jumbo. It's nowhere near what you're going to use. But let's talk about the makeup of the needle, because this is really important in, again, the success of our sewing project. The top part of the needle is the fattest part, and it has a flat portion on the back. On most sewing machines, when you put your needle into the machine, that flat part is going to face the back and the rounded part is going to be in the front. Now, a really important part of the needle is the middle section between the point and the bottom, and that is called the shaft. Now, why this is important is because the size of that is going to determine the size of your needle. So when you are looking at the package, you're going to see something down here on the bottom that says 9014, 7511, or any combination of some different numbers. And you're going to want to know what exactly are those. That's going to indicate how big this area is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But just know that the main body of the needle, the shaft, is the size and what's going to affect your fabric. The other important part of the needle is the point. Now we have the eye where our thread goes through, and that's the hole that's in the needle, but the point, the very tip of the needle, is going to determine what the type of needle is that you're using. And we're going to look at some examples here. On the table, I have things called Microtex, Ballpoint, Universal, Jeans, Leather, and Quilting. All of those labels are referencing the tip or the point of the needle. So again, just to reiterate, we have the tip of the needle, and then we have the shaft of the needle, which is the size. So those two different things are what you're going to be looking at in your machine needle. Now, before we talk more about the specifics of each one of these, what is important to know is that you change your needle frequently. And my rule of thumb is at least once per project. I sew a lot all day long, almost every day. So when I'm on my machine, if I've been doing a lot of sewing in a single day, I might actually just change my needle at the end of the day or when I start the following day. You may not need to do it if you're not sewing quite that much, but just know that after so many hours of sewing or at the end of a project, you should take the needle out, throw it away, and put a new one in. They're fairly inexpensive, and this tiny little tool really can affect the quality of your sewing. If you're sewing something and all of a sudden stitches are skipping, which means instead of a nice in and out of the fabric, you have stitches that aren't hugging or holding the fabric together, that can be caused by a needle that's not sharp anymore, or the wrong needle in your machine. Other things might be if you're sewing a lighter weight fabric and it starts to snag. That's a really big indicator that your needle is not very sharp. So just pay attention to that. And I find that quite a lot of times when people have trouble with their sewing machines, a lot of time it revolves around things that are going on with the needle. So it's really an important part. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the differences in the needles here. Let's start with our Universal, and I have two brands of needles on the table. I have a Classe needle and a Schmetz needle. The other thing maybe I want to mention before we kind of talk about the different types is that you do really want to stick to really these two brands of needles. Sometimes you can buy off the rack, off-brand needles, but the process that goes into making a needle really is very precision. And so I know that there's more standards and uniformity in how these needles are made. I don't need to tell you that here today, but the price, it's not going to affect the cost of your project anymore by having a better needle. So that's just really something that you want to make sure that you're working with one of these two brands. Okay, so we have the universal needle, and you probably received a package of these with your machine when you purchased it. And universal is kind of exactly what it's saying, that it really is meant to work on most fabrics. And as a new sewer, that's a really good go-to needle because most of your fabrics that you're going to be sewing are probably standard sewing fabrics. As you're learning and as you develop more skills, you'll probably delve into other specialty fabrics that might require some other needles. But that's a good one to start with. Another type of needle is a jeans needle, and that one's pretty self-explanatory as well. If you're working with a denim, then you might want to be using a jeans needle. Okay, we have leather. A leather needle is actually a really interesting one. The tip on the leather needle pokes holes in the leather, but how it penetrates the fabric isn't going to ruin the leather. If you're doing any kind of leather, you really want to make sure that you have a leather needle in there. Okay, we've got a quilting needle, and that's actually just one that, if you're getting into quilting, it's really important to have a needle that works with your quilting fabrics, some of your quilting stitches, and there's some specialty needs with that. Okay, your Schmetz, Microtex, or the sharp needle. Let's pull these here. I like to mention these because there are some beautiful fabrics out there. I have a few samples here. Maybe I might pick this little this one up here, and you can see how very delicate this is. Later on in our fabric lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about what fabrics are really good if you're a beginning sewer, but you can see that this one's very delicate, and you would really want a needle that has a very fine, very precision micro tip, and so that is really where your sharps or your Microtex come into play. When you have these delicate fabrics, heirloom sewing, if you're doing lace work, things like that where you just really need that fine special touch. So be aware that that's something that is available. And I have 4 packages of ballpoint needles here. And why is because I really want to emphasize that if you're sewing with knits, and a knit is a fabric that stretches, we have, let's pull this, this burgundy one out here, and it stretches, and we'll talk again in our fabric lesson a little more about that. But the thing about knits is that when they're made, they're like loops that interlock together. You wouldn't want to use like a leather or a jeans needle on them because the tip is going to put holes in those loops and possibly cut them, and then your fabric is going to run. The tip on the ballpoint needle is made so that it goes in between those loops and you're not going to ruin the integrity of how the fabric is made. So you can see that just with this little assortment here that there are some specific uses for different needles. You're going to run across some other needles such as a top stitching needle, a double needle, which is kind of interesting because your double needle literally is a needle you stick into your machine, but instead of one point, it has 2 actual full needles on there. And that's great for like a hem where you want double stitching, and there's many fun things and applications for that. But these are a really good starting point for understanding needles and why you have different needles for different fabrics. Let's talk a little bit about the size of the needle. I've already mentioned that the size of the needle printed on the package relates to the size of the shaft or the middle portion of the needle. And you can't see this on camera because it's very fine, but if you go to your sewing machine dealer store that sells your needles, go ahead and look at a Microtex needle and compare it to a leather needle. You are going to see that that whole middle section is very, very fine. And we know now that the Microtex or your sharp needle is meant to go through very fine fabrics. So naturally, the middle portion of the needle is not going to be chubby. It's going to be very slim and sleek so that it can go through that very delicate fabric. Your heavier leather or jeans needles or universal needles that have a higher number on them are going to be fatter, which is going to allow them to go through heavier bulkier fabrics such as a denim or a leather. And you know just from wearing a pair of jeans that denim material, which is what jeans are made of, is a lot bulkier than maybe something that you can see through. So you need a needle that's going to be strong enough to go in and out through that fabric and not break. And let's kind of conclude with what happens when your needle breaks. It will happen. It's very common in sewing. Sometimes you pull the fabric, or you have the wrong needle, or the needle is dull. It's very common in sewing, so don't panic if you go to sew and you hit your foot pedal and your needle breaks. Your machine's going to stop when that happens, and what you're going to want to do is unscrew the needle, pull the top of the needle out, and then you're probably going to open up your bobbin case and find the little tip of the needle that might have broken off. And some machines have a little pocket where they fall into the bottom of the machine too. So just know that that's common. Sometimes we do it by manual error. Other times it's just, for the reasons that I've just mentioned. But you can see that we have different sewing machine needles that are going to work with different fabrics. And if you just pay attention to the number, bigger needles such as leather and jeans are going to have a higher number, 14, 18, because they're bigger. Microtex or even just some of your universal needles might have a 9, 11, or 12 for your lighter fabrics. But if you're just looking for one universal needle that's going to go through most of your basic fabrics, then a universal size 12 or 14 is going to be a really good go-to needle until you experiment with some of the others. I hope this has been very helpful for you. The needle really is an important part of sewing. It's just one little piece of the puzzle, but take this, experiment with some fabrics and some different needles on your machine and see how they work with different fabrics. That also is going to give you an idea of what you're going to use when you begin your sewing projects. In our next video, we're going to take a look at how we actually sew, because if you're like me, you can't wait to get to the sewing machine. Thanks for joining us, and check us out in our next episode.